The Victorian culture is often portrayed as prudish, stuffy and dynamic, but perhaps with a dark undertone. You see, the Victorians were a bit like me and were very obsessed with death. They were under no illusions about death and dying, as Victorian England was very harsh. England was plagued with deplorable working conditions for the poor and a rapid increase in murder. As a result of the prevalence of death in Victorian culture, mourning became an art form, which was actually exemplified by Queen Victoria. There was a high mortality rate for children, and many adults did not survive beyond 50 years. The Victorians accepted death as reality, and they even planned for it. The funeral service was so elaborate in this era because death was so certain. For this reason, many families saved for years to pay for funeral services. However, we could learn a lot from the Victorians because they understood the value of celebrating a loved one's life and honouring their memory. So we'll start with the deathbed. Now, the deathbed of the dying became a focal point for families. Usually one or more grieving relatives surrounded the bed waiting to hear the last words that were symbolic of the departure from this world. The Victorians seemed to value the last words uttered by the dying. They were so valued that in order to hear a climactic testimony to the meaning of life from the dying, narcotics were actually discouraged. Victorian dying was informed by the concept of a good or a bad death. The Victorian good death was modelled from evangelical beliefs of being with family and making peace with God. A bad death was dying alone, with no one around you. And in the mid-19th century, death was too frequent and familiar to be denied, and as a result of this, Victorians encouraged close proximity to the dying. A slow death from, for example, TB was romanticised. It gives ample time for the spiritual reconciliation and for the production of deathbed drawings and memoirs. However, from around 1870, attitudes began to change as mortality rates declined and life expectancies rose. During the decline of Christian piety, people developed a new understanding of disease. Rather than preparing the soul, the primary concern was to ensure that death was pain-free and quick. Yet it was the First World War which truly dismantled the Victorian dying and mourning rituals. The enormous loss of life touched millions. The trauma of dying violently far away from family and the ensuing mass grief couldn't be further removed from the comforting image of a good death. Victorian society called for strict rules regarding mourning and the practices related to death. This is thought to have helped surviving family members cope with the loss of their loved ones. They lost loved ones regularly and it became a way of life. 57 out of every 100 children in working class families were deceased by the age of 5. And death was especially commonplace in the lower classes due to poor working conditions, overcrowded living conditions and unsanitary surroundings. There was a practice during the Victorian death called memento mori, which is Latin for remember you must die. Although this did not originate during the Victorian era, it was used more often because of the Victorian strange fascination with death. Jewellery such as a locket that held a piece of the deceased hair, death masks, and more importantly, photographs or portraits of the deceased often served as memorials to the departed. So post-mortem photography became popular. Many people could not afford to have their pictures taken whilst they were alive, so the only photographs would be of them when they were dead. Images usually show the dead surrounded by family, or looking if they were sleeping, or posing as if they were alive. The way the pictures were taken often meant that the living had to sit very still with the dead for quite a while to allow the photograph to be taken. This is how on some pictures, like this one, you can tell who the dead person is. They are usually the clearest in the picture, as they do not move an inch due to, well, being dead. It was seen as the deceased's lasting impression on society when a mourning portrait was commissioned. The pictures of children were often surrounded by flowers and were meant to have an ethereal appearance. It is thanks to the Victorians that we now have the practices of sending flowers to grieving families, and as well as having flowers predominantly displayed during memorials and funerals. However, families of adults who have passed would stage their loved ones in a particular room in a particular position with intentional items to evoke the memory of their loved ones. In America, this is now becoming a thing again. We see pictures of deceased posed in their fire trucks or on their motorbikes. So this is now making a comeback. Victorians were both religious and superstitious, and many precautions were taken so that the spirit of their deceased could pass on peacefully. Traditions were undertaken such as drawing the curtains, stopping the clocks at the time of death. Families would cover mirrors with dark cloth, based on the belief that a mirror can act as a looking glass and the spirit of the deceased could become trapped in it. They would also turn pictures face down and put black crepe on door handles. Now, families and friends of the deceased would look after the body. It was traditionally washed, dressed by the women folk of the family, and finally they would place on a nightcap or a bonnet to keep the jaw closed. After the passing, it was customary to prepare the house for the death watch, or the time between death and the funeral. The body of the deceased would be proudly displayed in the parlour or tucked away in the bed to make it look as though they were sleeping. The body would usually be on display for 2 days on a sawdust mattress. Sounds uncomfortable, but the sawdust was used to absorb any fluids that the body discharges after death, and pungent smells were disguised by placing lavender and herbs around the corpse. During the watch before the funeral, a ringing of the bell would ward off evil spirits. Now, the funeral was quite an affair. To attend a funeral required a written invitation, usually with a black border and delivered by a messenger. The funeral was often held at home unless the deceased was too prominent that the guests would not all fit in the house, but mourners could come beforehand to the house to pay their respects. The coffins were usually left open unless they were in the church. The family would be seated to reflect their relationship to the deceased, seated, if possible, in a separate room from the deceased so their guests would not be able to witness their grief. After the service, the family were escorted to be prepared for the procession to the graveyard. The add-ons usually reflected the family's wealth. If there were carriages, the first would contain the clergyman and the pallbearers, who were usually 6 friends of the deceased. The next carriage was the hearse, usually black for an adult or white for a child, with glass sides and decorated in gold and silver. Maybe extra black horses with black ostrich plumes or velvet coverings for the coffins and flowers. If the deceased had been in the mounted military, his horse would be in the parade after the hearse. Mourners, known as mutes, were employed to follow the coffin, looking suitably morose and angelic. The mourners wore black, and their widows would keep this up for a year, and others would wear black armbands. This was the time for the rise of the funeral director. Funerals had been previously arranged between the family and the church, but the extra pageantry gave rise to this job. While many of the Victorians didn't fear death, they did fear not being mourned properly. After the loved one had actually passed away, as we've just said, the women were expected to follow a complex code of mourning that lasted sometimes up to 2.5 years. For 12 months and a day they wore a plain black dress. After 1 year, the women could switch their dress fabric to silk coloured in lavender, mauve or violet. They were also forbidden from socialising during this 28-month period. Now, a Victorian funeral was an expensive and major rite of passage. Some people had more money spent on them when they died than when they were alive. Because you could belong to multiple funeral clubs, suspected infanticide was not uncommon, and in Manchester there was a saying, "Aye, aye, that child shall not live, it is for the burial club." That wasn't a Manchester accent, I don't know what that was. Funeral directors would find out how much money was in the pot for the funeral club and tailor the funeral for the budget. Of the 100 deaths a day in London in the 1840s, 250 undertakers competed for the bodies. No wonder undertakers were depicted as sinister characters, not much better than the dreaded body snatchers. They exploited their grieving clients and were able to influence them by making them feel guilty, so they spent more. After all, an elaborate send-off was testament to their respect. Funerals were often performed as soon as possible, Saturday being the day for aristocrats and Sunday for the day of paupers. In the next episode, we are going to look at Victorian graveyards, their symbolism, and how the dead literally spilled into the lives of the living. So stay tuned.